Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the webinar this morning. We still have a few people joining, so I'm going to give it 1 minute and then I will start the webinar. So we have about 120 people coming, so they're all still being attended, not attended, admitted, but I will start the webinar in about 1 minute. Alrighty, so I'm going to start. I'm going to just introduce myself, but I think most of you know me. My name is Nikki Hardwick. I'm a consultant at HRTorQue. I head up the Human Resources Division, Outsourced Human Resources Division. And I have been dealing with employment equity since 2003. So I've seen it go through the various changes. And so today what we're going to be doing is just chatting regarding the changes to the Employment Equity Act. Just by a show of hands, can everybody firstly see the slides and can everybody hear me? Just want to check. Thank you, everybody. Okay, great. So if at any point something happens with the sound, if you could just pop it in a chat, that would be great. Okay, so what I'm going to do today, because I know that there's very many questions and people have things that I'm going to try and go through as broadly some of the major changes that are going to be happening and that will affect, I'm going to say, the majority of people. It's going to be fairly practical, but if you do have any questions, I have allowed for an hour and a half today. So I'm very happy to have questions posted in the chat. I have Charlene with me. And so as questions come about, you can post them in the chat and I will try and make the session fairly interactive. What we'll also do is this session, as with all of our other webinars, will be available on our YouTube channel, probably within about a week. So it's regularly put up. Most of the webinars are put up onto our YouTube channel. So if you have to leave before the end of it, or you want to go back and watch it, you are more than welcome to do it as soon as it is loaded on the YouTube channel. So just in terms of the changes to the Employment Equity Act, so they did become effective 1st of January. There were a couple of couple of queries regarding the submission of employment equity reports. So anybody who was under 50 employees still needed to submit by the 15th of January. But anybody who is under 50 employees with effect from 1st of January is now no longer designated. So one of the big changes that most people are aware of is the fact that if you are under 50 employees, you are now no longer designated, which in essence means you don't have to comply. As we get, you can't see, can everybody else see the slideshow? I know one person can't see it. Everyone else can see it. So if you can't see the slideshow, possibly exit the meeting and maybe rejoin. It could be a connection issue on your side. Okay. So as I was saying, so the changes came into effect on the 1st of January. And in essence, what happened is one of the major changes was the fact that if you were under 50 employees, is you now no longer have to submit this year. I'll go into the deregistration process and what is supposed to be happening in the year. So do you still need to deregister? Or do you not need to deregister? So I'll try and answer as many questions as I possibly can. But as I said before, for those of you still joining, please feel free to post any questions that you have in the chat, and I'll try and answer as many of them as I can as we go through. Okay. In essence, what we're going to be just discussing today is the changes to the designated employers, deregistration process, the sector targets and the timelines for those, the new employment equity plan implementation, and what are the expectations of you as an employer. Okay, if you cannot see the slides, my suggestion is maybe try to change your connection or leave the meeting and rejoin again. My understanding is most participants can see the slides, so it might be a connection issue on your side. Okay. Alrighty. Okay, so in terms of the major changes, there are some changes in terms of things like compliance certificates and, you know, how they go and do compliance, but I'm not going to talk about those specifically, so how you'll be audited, etc. What I am going to talk about is the major things that would affect most employees, not employees, sorry, employers. So the previous definition was specifically related to designated employers. So previously, if you were under 50 employees, but had a turnover exceeding that within the particular threshold sector that you were in, you would be designated. So you could have 2 employees, but still have a turnover in excess of whatever it was in the schedule, and you would then be designated, meaning that you needed to comply. Okay. With the new amendment, which is now coming into effect on 1st of January, it moves that threshold completely. And so there is no longer the turnover threshold. And so the only requirement here in terms of majority of the employers is you need to have more than 50 employees. Can everyone hear me? So someone is saying the sound quality is bad. Can everyone hear me, or is it just that one person? Everyone else can hear me. Okay. Thanks, guys. All right. Okay, so as I said, now the only requirement is if you are more than 50 employees, you are now designated. So in the previous legislation, or the old legislation, if we want to call it that, there was an ability for you to submit voluntarily. So you as an employer could decide that you wanted to submit voluntarily. My understanding, based on the 2023 roadshow, so the new legislation was supposed to come into effect in 24. When we attended the roadshow in 2023, what was said at that point is that there's now no longer an ability for you to submit voluntarily. So in terms of the system, so the portal that you would, the online portal, is you would log in. And now if you are under 50, there's no longer, it's almost grayed out. You will not have the ability to submit. Okay. So if you're under 50, you just can't submit. The impact is that now people below 50 are no longer needing to do employment equity plans. They don't need to do reporting. They will no longer need to have committees. You can choose to do that on your own, but no one is going to be checking whether or not you've done that. So that will be effective 1st of January. Okay. That's the major implication to designated employers. I do think I'll talk about it later, but a couple of questions have come about in terms of if you are under 50 employees, how do you go about deregistering? Based on the roadshow, that was what was explained is that there is an assumption that if in 2024, as an example, if you have less than 50 employees, they will automatically assume that this year you are less than 50 employees, and you will no longer be able to submit. The portal, however, so it's no longer a deregistration process from what I understand, but I assume that more information will be forthcoming. As I assume, because currently the legislation said that if you were under 50 or if your turnover was less than the designated amount, you would have to deregister, so to submit documentation to Department of Labour between 1st of April and 31st of August. And at that point, they would then consider your application and decide if you need to be deregistered. If you were deregistered, you were no longer able to access the Employment Equity Portal for submission. The understanding now, however, is when we look at the compliance certificate, which I will again talk about later, is now you have an ability to get your compliance certificate. And that compliance certificate is supposed to be the door or the gateway for you to be able to do business in, government sectors and tenders, et cetera, So even if you're under 50 employees, there's no longer the requirement for you to do the employment equity report, but you still have the ability to get the compliance certificate. And that compliance certificate for people with less than 50 employees is based on the fact that from a CCMA perspective or possibly bargaining council, if you're in a bargaining council, you have no cases within the last 12 months of a minimum wage issue or harassment in the workplace. So if you don't have any of those things, so finding against you at CCMA, you have the ability to apply for that certificate if you are under 50 people. And the way that you get that certificate is through the portal. So you now no longer specifically deregister. You will still be able to access that portal. And again, my understanding is that you do that from the 15th of September or the 1st of September when it opens. You would then log on, have the ability to apply for your certificate, which is then valid for a year. And that you can use, from a business perspective, much like the COID, certificate of good standing. It's that sort of concept. If you are over 50 employees, the requirement for you to get that certificate, one, will be your ability to have submitted, and two, you will also need to have complied on various other aspects. But in terms of a deregistration process, from a smaller business perspective, you won't have to, from what they described, is that you don't specifically deregister because you still need to access that portal. And so you will go into one section, but not necessarily the reporting section. Okay. Just for those of you that are still joining, if anyone has any questions, please pop them in the chat and I will answer them as I get to things. Okay. So just in terms of a timeline, so as the notification was sent last year that the Employment Equity Act was officially changing, so this has been in the pipeline for some time. So as I've said, it is in effect from the 1st of January. But what is not yet done, which a lot of people are a little bit confused about, is the sector targets have not yet been signed off. So as employers, we don't have the ability to put in place new plans. So one of the major things that we as employers have to do is we have to put in place a new plan, understanding that what the intention is that every employer who is designated will have a plan for 5 years. That plan will run from, I think it's it'll be, the baseline will be 1st of September to 31st of August, and it'll run from 2025 to 2030. So every single employer in South Africa that needs to submit will run for a 5-year period. If you become designated, let's say in 2027, you will then have a plan that runs from 27 to 30. So all employers will work on the same basis and everybody will have to have a plan that runs during that time. So it's no longer a case of you run from, June to May, or somebody else is running from, I don't know, February to January, or whatever the story is. Every single plan will need to run in the same time. And we can only do those plans once the sector targets have been signed off. So many of you, I assume, would have got a notification from Department of Labour in relation to your particular sector to have consultations. It's an online session in which you can then give your input into the sector targets that have been distributed. They were distributed last year, I want to say in February. There were some changes. So the original targets were quite complicated. They gave in each level, with exception of semi-skilled and unskilled, they gave each particular target for African male, coloured male, Indian, and so we went. The new targets, and I'll show you in a slide later, are a lot simpler. They are still as per the 18 sectors, but those have not been signed off yet. They are doing the consultations, and my recommendation is that I would suggest that as an employer, you attend those consultations. It is going to impact you because in 5 years' time, they're going to ask you the questions as to why you did not achieve those targets. We expect or estimate that the release date for the signed off sector targets will be the 1st of April 2025. So that is what is expected to happen. Once those are in place, and obviously we do have the sector targets that they put out for comment. So, unless they change drastically, if you as a business are wanting to start to look at your new plan, remembering that whatever plan you have in place, even if that plan still has another 3 years to go, you no longer, that plan will fall away. You have to do the new plan, which will start 1st of September. And remembering the new plan is based on the sector targets. The previous legislation allowed the ability for anybody to have a plan that went from 1 to 5 years. So you could choose between 1 to 5 years. As I've said before, there is now no longer an ability to do that. The sector targets are based on a 5-year target that you need to achieve in year 5. Every employer will have to go on the same basis and they will be monitoring everybody year on year. So when we went in 2023 and the intention was to implement the changes in 24, they actually showed us what the new system was going to look like. And there are some changes to the new system. So in essence, what they're going to be doing, and I'm sorry, probably jumping around a little bit, but in essence, what they're going to be doing, so those of you who've gone up to the portal, it pretty much looks exactly the same as the EEA2 and EEA4. Where it is, and Lisa was suggested in 2023, where it is going to be different is you as the employer will have to, this year put in your annual targets from 2020, so it'll be 26, 27, 28, 29, 30. So what is it that you're intending to achieve year on year on year? So the old reporting was you literally just had to do, what do we want to do next year? And then at the end of the plan. Which I think possibly allowed people to, not that they were supposed to, is, change their numbers. Now in year zero, if that's what we want to call it, in year zero, you're submitting to Department of Labour this year what your targets are for each year and how you're intending to achieve the sector targets. What will then happen, at least in the system that they showed, and if it hasn't changed, is what then happens is when we submit next year, they will take your workforce profile for September next year and compare it to your target that you said that you were going to achieve. If you haven't achieved it, they're going to ask you why you didn't, and you're going to have to justify that. So when you're starting to prepare, in as much as we don't have the finalized sector targets now, my suggestion is you start to identify what it is that you're planning to achieve for the next 5 years, even if we're using the non-signed or sector targets, and I will go through it with you shortly. But if you do want to wait till the 1st of April, when they are going to hopefully, share the finalized targets, what you then need to do is to now begin to consult with your committee and put in your 5-year targets. Okay. What we will then do is from the 1st of April, you will then need to work towards getting a finalized plan, which should be in place hopefully by the 1st of September, remembering that you do need to consult with your committee. I think it's either going to be 1st of October 2025 to the 30th of September, or it will be 1st of September to 31st of August. I'm not clear on exactly which dates, but those will then be, when we get the sector targets, they will define exactly the time frame, whether it's 1st of October to 30th of September or 1st of September to August. I think it's going to be October, but what we will need to do is you will need to have your plan in place at least by September. So you'll have April to September to consult with your committee, have a look at your affirmative action measures, what are your barriers, have a look at the sector targets, and to identify how you are going to get there. I will go through, the other things in terms of what you need to consider, understanding that you can no longer just say things like, oh, well, we don't get CVs. There's now going to be a much greater push, which is why they put in the sector targets, is to say employers are not moving fast enough. And so we are putting in bite-sized chunks to basically assist you to get to the EAP. So we're putting in the sector targets now and basically pushing employers to get to the EAP. That's the ultimate objective. So when we look at going forward, the things that you need to do is you need to conduct a workforce analysis, which is stuff that you can start to do now anyway. And I would recommend that you start to do that in line with the proposed sector targets. I don't foresee there being massive changes. So you can look at the proposed sector targets and identify where you are falling short. One of the things that they have said is that if you have a particular category of staff in which that category of staff has reached the EAP already, you no longer need to put in any sort of specific measure for that particular group because that group has reached EAP. Any other group that has not reached either the sector target, well, if you haven't reached the sector target, you haven't reached EAP. If they haven't reached that particular sector, then you do need to put something in place to try and you've got to put in strategies. You have to actively try and get to the sector target. But if you've reached it, you are not required to put anything in place for that. Okay. The other things that you need to do, so part of your employment equity plan, and I would suggest your strategy is to start aligning your recruitment, your promotions, have a look at your turnover, what are your retention strategies, so start to align from a business perspective what the intention is of you getting to that point. And as I said before, just in case anybody wasn't here, the reason why this becomes not just a quarterly meeting, not just an annual sort of submission, is that one, your compliance certificate is going to be impacted by this. But two, when you submit your annual report, is at the beginning, they're asking you for your annual targets. And what they are going to be doing is saying, why did you not meet it? So every year we're going to have to justify to Department of Labour why you didn't meet that target. I will go through a little bit later, I will go through the justifications, but understanding that the compliance certificate, and again, I'll go through the compliance certificate shortly. A lot of people are saying, well, I don't do work with government. Remembering that if you do BEE, what is probably going to happen is the requirement for you to get your points on the equity side of things will more than likely be the submission of a compliance certificate. So if you're not compliant and you can't supply that currently, you have to supply, I think it's your acknowledgement of submission to your BEE verification agents to say that you have done that. I suspect, although I can't necessarily say that I've been told this, but I suspect in the future what they're going to ask for is that compliance certificate, and if you don't have it, it will then affect your BEE. So this almost needs to become part of your strategy, your recruitment managers, when people are recruiting, and I will give you some, examples of the kinds of things that you can do. This cannot just be an annual thing. You are now having to justify, you are now having to say why you didn't do it. And the normal response of, oh, well, we didn't get CVs is probably not going to be sufficient. Okay. All righty. Okay, so in terms of practical steps obviously I would assume the fact that most of you are here, you are probably all designated, so, that's fine. Then I would say, start to look at your sector targets now. I would highly recommend that you attend the sessions. A lot of people are saying, what's the point? But by attending the sessions, you start to understand, what is the intention and what are Department of Labour going to be looking at. So I would highly recommend, whether or not you think your comments are going to make any difference whatsoever, attend the sessions, understand what they're looking for, so that you, in your space as the equity manager, as the CEO, or whoever it is that is attending now, you're able to understand what are the requirements and what are they going to be holding you to. Then, as I've said, and I've already said this, you're going to need to align your employment equity plan. What you had in place may no longer apply. You are now going to be having to put in place a brand new employment equity plan, regardless of what you've had in the past. There has been a question in terms of, if there was an issue with your previous plan, what will happen in an audit? So up until this point, if they've done an audit, they've had the ability to go back a number of years to check what has happened. So if they didn't like the plan, or if they didn't, they could make you change everything. What will happen now if we are moving into a brand new space with a new plan? Can they still audit previous, submissions, previous plans? My understanding is that this is a completely new legislation. Everything that has gone before possibly is wiped clean, but that remains to be seen. So make sure that in the event that you have an audit, that you still have all of your documentations, your previous plans, your minutes, your committees, etc. Make sure that you have that in the event they do audit. That waiting to be answered is, if your plan expires during this year, remembering we haven't got the sector targets, we don't know what they are, what do we need to do in the interim? So that is a question that has been asked, and I'm still waiting on an answer for that, because obviously in terms of compliance, you cannot have a time that you don't have an employment equity plan, but we're not entirely sure if your plan ends, for argument's sake, on the end of February. Must you put in a new plan from the 1st of March to when the new plan comes into place? As soon as I have an answer on that, I will share it with the group, but I don't have an answer specifically. But remembering that if you are audited and you don't have a plan, the legislation says that you can at no point be without a plan, but that is something that I don't have an answer on. Okay. All righty. Prepare for the compliance certification. So what we need to do is you need to ensure that your employment equity reports are submitted, in September. You must maintain all records demonstrating, that you're trying to get to the sector targets. And remembering that the compliance certificate, one is the employment equity, but there is the other element now that says that in order to get your compliance certificate, there cannot be a case against you in which you have been a case against you at the CCMA in which you have been found, it's been found against you in the last 12 months of either harassment and or that you haven't been paying minimum wage. So one of the key things, one of the elements of unfair discrimination is harassment in the workplace. For those of you who are not aware, there was a code of good practice in relation to sexual harassment, which was changed. I'm going to get my years wrong now, but I think it was changed in 2022. So it was March 2022. So there's now a new code of good practice, which doesn't deal specifically with sexual harassment, but harassment in the workplace. And it's one of the key things in terms of employment equity. The requirements of an employer are much greater. So you can't just have a policy. And if somebody makes a claim of harassment against you, you need to be able to prove, not necessarily that you find the person guilty, but that you as an employer have put certain things in place. So the onus is much greater on you. And if you go to CCMA and somebody lodges a case, and you are found lacking, that will then impact your ability to get your certificate. Part of this whole thing, and in terms of creating, I will get to that question shortly. Part of this entire thing as well is that make sure that you are communicating with your various stakeholders. So if you in the past had an equity committee that you didn't really engage with or wasn't interested, we are finding in the audits now, and I suspect it will become far greater, is the requirement that people are engaged and that people, so let me say this, people should be engaged, but and they're not always, but you need to be having the equity committee meetings. Those committee meetings have to have certain things spoken about. It cannot be a monthly meeting in which you have a management meeting or you have a staff meeting and you pop some equity in there. It has to be a specific employment equity meetings. There are specific things that you need to be discussing. The minutes need to be done in a particular way, and you do need to have not necessarily I know that the employment equity report, the EA2 says, are you meeting monthly or quarterly? But you do need to have a number of meetings, or at least have, 2 or 3 in the year in which you're consulting with people. Excuse me. The minutes, when we're doing audits now, so that's one of the things where they will look at and say, you didn't communicate with anybody, you didn't consult with anybody, you didn't engage with anybody, and so your employment equity plan is null and void. So you may have the best employment equity plan, and this is probably going to be audited on a far greater scale when we go into this new legislation, is they are looking at what you're discussing. You cannot have minutes that just say equity meeting, discussed plan, discussed barriers, discussed affirmative action measures, everybody in agreement, because they won't accept that. So if you're not sure if your minutes are acceptable, you're more than welcome to chat with us. We've done a number of audits where, we now know what various inspectors are looking for. So if you're not sure, then please chat with us, because rather be prepared, because it is something that is happening, and we are having a lot of audits with clients. And one of the key things is you can have the best plan, you can have the best analysis. If you aren't consulting and it's not done accurately, and the consultation must happen prior to the signing off of your plan, it cannot happen afterwards, then your plan is actually null and void. If you have trade unions, they need to be part of the committee, and you need to ensure that your committee is representative of everyone in your organization. So just make sure that you've kind of looked at all of those things, and that when you go into this new phase, that is sort of done. Okay. The question that I have here is a company with over 50 employees required to submit an employment equity report, even if it exclusively serves overseas clients? Yes. So if you are a South African company and you are based here, you are then and everybody is based here. So you're employing people here, they pay tax here, assuming they're not true independent contractors. If they're employees, they are based here, then and you're paying tax and you have a PAYE number, etc. If they are based in South Africa, then you are required to comply. If, however, you're a South African company, or you're employing people overseas, but they're not paying tax here, they're based in another company, that would be different. But if they are people that are living here, then you would need to do that. Okay. Okay. I think that I've kind of gone through this already. I want to start going, I'm just having a look at what I'm saying here. So these kinds of things that, I will go more in practical sort of, what are you going to do to ensure that if you are audited and if you have, how do we make sure, what are some of the strategies that you can do to ensure that, the people on the ground, your hiring managers, your people who are doing training, etc., what are you going to do to ensure that you comply? So if we have a look, and I'm going to go through the sector targets, this is not all of the targets. So I'm hoping it doesn't look very good. But basically, when we look at the sector targets, the previous ones were quite complicated. But these were the 5-year sector targets, which they have put out for comment. That session that I spoke to you about, this is what they're going to be discussing. So there are 18 different sectors, which you would decide which one you fall in. So based on what you've been submitting, you would probably fall into a lot of these. And within that sector, they have decided, sorry, 1 second. They basically issued targets that you need to meet. So previously, they had targets in which they said Limpopo, the different provinces, and in some provinces they had targets of 0, which obviously made people very unhappy because it was, they were saying we can't employ people. But in essence, what this is, and I'll go into it more practicality now, they've issued targets for the first 4 levels. And what's basically happening here is in top management, for argument's sake. So if we look at, I'm just going to try and use my pointer here. If we look at this one over here, so each sector will have their own particular one. We've got top management, senior management, professionally qualified, and skilled technical. What they've then done is they've said in the designated groups, so remembering in the designated groups, specifically in male, it is African, colored, and Indian. And females, it is African, colored, Indian, and white. Then they have a thing down here for people with disabilities, which is basically all races and all genders. They do not include foreign nationals because there is no specific target for foreign nationals. And so that is not even mentioned here. But in essence, what they've done here is they've said, and this is where people misunderstood the previous targets, is what they have said is the ultimate goal is for everybody to reach EAP. So remembering that the EAP, which is the economically active population, is out of 100%. So they're saying out of 100%, we would like you to get 45% African male. We want you to get 2%, I don't know the numbers off by heart, but 2% Indian male, and so we go. What they've done here is they've said by the end of 5 years, we want you, for argument's sake, over here, you need to reach, I can't see it, but you need to reach 26%, for argument's sake. So in wholesale and retail, I'm hoping it says 26%. My eyes are terrible. 25%, thank you, Charlene. So in designated males, which is collectively African, Indian, and colored, by the year, at the end of 5 years, we want representation in top management to be 25% African, Indian, and colored. Okay. My understanding is that it has further been broken down. So you could have 25% African, Indian, colored. The other 75% of males in that group, you can do what you like. So it could be foreign nationals, it could be white males, it doesn't really matter. But they would like you to achieve 25%. At the end of the next 5 years, so by the end of 5 years, they want you to achieve 25%. When they give us the next targets, they might say, we want you now to achieve, I don't know, let's for argument's sake say 30% and then 40% or whatever it is. So each sector has their own, this is what we want you to do. As an EAP, that was the maximum that they wanted you to achieve. So as African males, I want you to get to 45%. So of all the people in there, 45% need to be African males, whereas the sector targets is the minimum that they want you to achieve. So at a minimum, we're requesting that you have 25%. And so as you go down, when we look at females, I think it says 16.9%. Okay, I'm just going to go, so over here, they want 16%, 15, thank you very much. They want 15% of representation in top management to be female. So that includes, so it doesn't matter who you've got there, 15% representation in top management must be female. What they then want to do, which becomes, and so it goes. So it continues to go down and the numbers change depending on your particular sector, but that's what they want you to achieve by, I'll talk about what happens shortly if the targets are not met. Okay. What they then further want you to do, remembering, and I'll go into the next stage now, is that we still have EAP. So the ultimate objective of this is they want everybody to achieve the EAP. Okay. So that is your end goal. If you've achieved it, fantastic, that's wonderful. But this purpose of the sector targets is to try and push you, because they're saying people are not doing it, is to try and push you to get ultimately to your EAP. So they're giving you bite-sized chunks now to say, this is how we want you to go. What they're also then saying is that in as much as we've got the 25% here, or the 15%, is in that 15%, you still need to break it down. So we've got our EAP, and I'm going to just slide over to the next slide here, which will hopefully make it a little bit easier for me to see, is in this section over here, we still have the provincial targets. Okay. So in this section here, and I do apologize, I actually can't see it, but I know we've got 45% African male. I think in African female, we have, I think 42%. So when we look at our sector targets, what you're required to do is you still need to say of the 15%, so what you can't do is go 15%, okay, let's just fill them all up for argument's sake with white females. What they still want you to do is to break up that 15% and try and allocate it in line with the EAP. So if you're in Limpopo, the EAP will be slightly different to if you're in the Western Cape or if you are, somewhere else. So you still need to apply your mind and go, we can't just fill everybody with white females for argument's sake or put African females because that doesn't necessarily align. But if you have 4 positions or 10 positions, you still need to, when you recruit, go, okay, we've made our 15%, but if that 15% is only white females, it's still not aligning to the EAP. So you take your 15% and you try and divvy it up as best as you can, aligning it to the EAP. So if you have, an overrepresentation of white females in terms of the EAP, you've met your 15%, but you need to then, when you do your recruitment, you then need to now focus on possibly recruiting in one of the other categories to try and meet your EAP. Remembering that the ultimate goal, and whenever years it is to come, is for everybody to work towards EAP. So this is what they're providing in terms of the sector targets. They're doing their consultations, and they are saying to people, come and talk to us, tell us what you think. So you will see as they go further down, the percentage that they're wanting you to look at is bigger, but none of these percentages are out of 100 at that point. Okay. The sector targets don't apply if you are not designated. Remembering, if you're not designated, you no longer have to do sector targets. You don't have to do meetings. You cannot submit a report. You don't have to have an employment equity plan. You don't have to do any of those things. Sorry, guys, 1 second. But none of this would apply to you. Okay. If, however, so this is just a thing to say to you, if you're a growing business and you are, expecting that within the next couple of years that you're possibly going to be over 50, I would suggest that you keep this in the back of your mind. You don't want to get to 50 and not sort of have something in the back of your mind going, are we moving in the right direction? But there is no obligation for you to do this if you are under 50. And remember, turnover doesn't apply anymore. So the only line in the sand is 50 employees. And just be careful of, saying, we don't want to have employees, so we're going to put everybody on as an independent contractor. Those things don't work very well. Ultimately, you could get yourself into trouble, but just be careful of trying to hide things. There are there are fines for employers who deliberately try to not have to comply with the legislation. I'm not entirely sure if anyone has ever actually been fined. I think that there are cases like that. So just be careful of trying to manipulate things to not become designated. Okay. So as I was saying, we've got the 4 top levels, which is top management, senior management, professionally qualified. I've only shown you a couple of the sector targets here, but they do have 18 sectors. You would need to decide which sector you fall in based on what is most like you. Okay. You would also then need to decide, and what will happen is when you're doing your employment equity plan, you, in addition to going with your sector target, you also need to decide, are you going to use the national or the provincial EAP? Once you decide on something, you will not be able to change it for the duration of your plan. You also, if you have a majority of your people in KZN, then you must choose KZN. If you are national, then you must choose national. But you don't have the ability to chop and change, which does create a little bit of a problem, because if you, for argument's sake, started in KZN and then you move your business, for argument's sake, to Western Cape, the AP is different there. But you do not have the ability to change during the plan. So if you did deviate and now you're moving somewhere different, that could be a reason for the deviation in your plan. And I'll talk about deviations now, and as I go to the next slide, is one of the issues here, for argument's sake, and I'll try and explain it in greater detail, is when we do our plan, we're obviously working on a projected head count. So let's assume, for argument's sake, we work on a projected head count of 100. If for whatever reason we now go to 300, when you're reporting on an annual basis, if we said 100, now you've got 300, every single year you are going to have a deviation. And so when you report on that deviation, and my understanding is, and I haven't seen the system yet, is they will note, because they're going to compare your workforce profile for year 1 against what your targets were. It will note a deviation, because they will do a formula and they'll check it and they'll say you've deviated, in various categories. What is the reason for your deviation, which I'll go through now. You are going to have to declare that every year. Okay. If they come and audit it and they say, you said your deviation was for this reason, we've now come and audited it and we realize that you actually lied, they can at that point remove your certificate from you and obviously put you under audit, and then you're going to have to answer to it. But you will, on an annual basis, have to declare why there's a deviation. If you, for argument's sake, projected 100, but you've now had to retrench a whole lot of people and are now at 60, that will be a reason for deviation. So the deviation is not necessarily always going to be because we couldn't employ people or we couldn't find the right, type of person. So we were aiming for an African female and we couldn't find it, so we went with an Indian female. It won't always be that. But if you deviate from what you said in terms of headcounts and that kind of thing, it will show that there's a deviation and you're going to have to justify that. In terms of semi-skilled and unskilled, you will still need to move towards EAP. So those particular groups, you will need to move towards EAP anyway. They haven't issued sector targets for those levels. You need to just look at what your EAP is. And obviously, as I said before, decide if you're going to use national or if you're going to use your particular province. Once you have decided, that's it. That is what you have to do for the next 5 years. So make sure that once you decide something, you decide it correctly, and because you're not able to change it. Also, I would suggest, when you're looking at a projection in terms of numbers, try and make it a little bit more scientific. You can possibly use, the last maybe 5 years of turnover and retention. Plan it in terms of if that's what happened in the last 5 years. Do a plan going forward and say, what do we expect is going to happen? So I know that we can't, 100% know what's going to happen in 5 years, but try and make it as realistic as you possibly can using the data that you have within your business. So there are ways in which you can, forecast using last 5 years as an example to understand where you're going to be going. It just makes it a little bit easier if it's a bit more scientific as opposed to a thumbsuck. Then you can start to use things like, well, I know Bob, for argument's sake, is going to be retiring. I know that so-and-so is moving overseas. And so we expect these things are going to be happening. And then when you're doing your analysis, is actually keep notes on that. So I expected that Bob was going to retire. And if Bob retired, this is what was going to happen. I expected to, buy a company or whatever the story is, but have your justifications in the beginning. So in 3 years, when that doesn't happen and you're going to go back on your documentation, you can understand what you thought was going to happen. Whereas previously, a lot of employers just kind of go, okay, well, this is what we imagine. And then, if it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen. We just say, oh, it didn't happen. Okay. So some of the things, I think I had a question. I don't know if I answered it. Hold on 1 second. I think I have answered it. Okay. So just in terms of some of the things that I would suggest that you do is when we look at, so up the top here, and I really hope that everybody can see it, is if you're going to do your analysis, what I would suggest is you make it a little bit more scientific. What we do is we start to identify, in your snapshots, and this is not that there is a new EEA 12 and there is a new EEA 13. It was shared in 2023. I'm not sure if it's exactly the same, but I think that they're planning on distributing it or having it available, I think, in March. So we will be able to see what the new documentation looks like. We'll be able to see what the new format of the plan looks like, and if there are any changes that they're looking for. But if you're going to do your plan, what you should be doing is almost looking at it and understanding based on our current head count, where do we look in terms of EAP? Have we met the EAP? So in this instance, I think I've used KZN. And then here you can see, I haven't done the exact formula, but here you've got, and I don't know, professionally qualified, I think it's wholesale and retail. You can see here, I think this is 38%. So in this particular group, for argument's sake, we need to reach 38% of the head count needs to be African Indian and colored. In that 38%, we now need to apply. So in that 38%, 45, I think it's 45 of that should be African male. When we look at our current head count, how much over or under are we? So do we need to, if we stayed at this head count, how many people would we need to have? And I know that it says we've got, negatives. Remembering in the change to legislation, it specifically says that you cannot terminate people's contracts. You cannot fire people because of race or gender and because they don't meet your targets. The idea here is what you're looking at, and I'll go into this particular grid now, is you're saying when we're going to do our plan, how much over or under are we? So we assume, for argument's sake, if we're over or if we're under. So if we're over in a particular group, if 3 people in that group left, which is our biggest pain point? Where do we need to go? So on a level from 1 to 3, what would be our first prize? What would be our second prize? And what would be our third prize? And then you're able to then go, okay, so in year 1, I would actually, if you're going to do a plan, I would start at year 5 and I would actually work my way back and see if we changed it like that, how would it look? So if these people left and if this happened and if I took on 10 people, what am I actually going to have to do? And you can start to see by, darker colors where the biggest problem is and, the other colors where it's, either over or under. And then what I would suggest is actually on a monthly basis, or depending on how quickly things change in your business, is you actually do a movements and shortfall against your plan. Remembering that when we did our plan, so you do it against the target, so for the following year. So how are we moving towards that target? And what you do is you say, well, this is what our plan was. This is what we said we were going to achieve. We needed to get, 5 or 10 or 15 people. How close are we to that? So are we over or under? So you will see here, how close are we towards our plan? We're achieving it, we're not achieving it, we're over, we're under. And then what you do is you say, how close are we towards the EAP? So if we reached our plan, how are we doing? But also what we need to do, and this will say EAP, my suggestion is we obviously go to sector targets, but this is based on headcount. And the reason why you need to do that is because if we had our plan that said we were going to have 10 people, if we now have 20 people, we can't keep working towards, the 2 people that we planned in the particular group. Now we need to possibly be looking at 4 people. So in as much as we work to the plan, once we've achieved the plan, that's great. So we've achieved our plan, we've got the people, but we now have more people. So you should compare yourself on a monthly basis or quarterly basis against, are you achieving according to your plan? But secondly, is are you achieving in terms of headcount? Because as your headcount changes, you also need to then reevaluate how close you're getting. Often where things fall short is we will look at our plan and says, oh, we needed 2 African males. And then we go, oh, yes, we got the 2 African males. But those 2 African males were based on the fact that you had 10 people. If you now have 30 people, the fact that you've got 2 African males is now not sufficient. And so it's a constant moving thing. And I would suggest that you need to almost evaluate it on a again, depending on how quickly things move. And then what you do is you almost give to people who are recruiting in particular positions to go, you're recruiting for whatever, it's a skilled technical position based on what we're doing. The number 1 priority would be, for argument's sake, say a colored female. Number 2 priority would be an African female, and so we go. In 3 months' time, when we've filled all the positions and we've actually met where we need to go with colored females, that's now no longer the priority. So when we're recruiting in 3 months' time, they now get something else that says, oh, hang on, now the priority is an African female. But as things change, so too changes your priority. And if you're making it part of how things happen, as opposed to a sort of side thing, you don't get to move. So I would suggest that what you do is you actually make it part and parcel of the recruitment process, not based on the document that we did 3 years ago that said, oh, we needed 2 African males, but it has to be a constant thing. And like I said, depending on how much things change, this would also relate to promotion. So as people move in and out of levels, so too will, obviously the demographics within that level. So you can't look at it on an annual basis. It needs to be part and parcel of the strategy of the business to ensure that it's front of mind. And that when people are recruiting, when they're looking at CVs, and I'm not suggesting that we go, oh, yes, it must be this demographic, forget everybody else, and if they can't do the job. But when people are looking at the CVs and going, okay, first prize, second prize, third prize, they're actively thinking about it and going, can I make a different decision, as opposed to not thinking about it. If they then deviate from, priority 1, priority 2, priority 3, they almost need to come to you and say, this is why I had to deviate. I had to deviate because there was nobody that was sufficiently skilled. I had to deviate because, people who I'm looking for can't get here, so the transport is too expensive, or whatever the story is. But people are coming to you and actually justifying why they didn't reach that target, as opposed to it is something that you look at in, 3 years when you're trying to justify. So these are the kinds of things that I would suggest that you need to do in order to make it front of mind, so that when you are reporting, you have that information. When you're going to Department of Labour and saying, why did we deviate? You're able to then actually justify, and you have documentation. So it doesn't need to be overly onerous, but it does need to be something that is part of your strategy. Okay. And again, I'm not suggesting that you employ people solely based on their gender or race, but it must be one of the factors. So when you do recruiting or promoting, whatever, normally you'll have a number of factors that you'll say, oh, driver's license must have a qualification. One of the factors in there needs to be, in terms of priorities, do they meet that priority? It's not the only one, but it needs to be part and parcel of it. Okay. All righty. So just in terms of, so this was part of the change to the legislation. So just some of the things that I wanted to highlight here is just in terms of the barriers and the affirmative action measures. So in terms of, and this has always been, this has always been part of the legislation. So in terms of preparing and implementing the plan, the key things in compliance with affirmative action measures is we must take the following things into account. I want to reiterate that this has always been part of the Act, but you do need to take into account things like the inherent requirements of the job. What Department of Labour have said, though, is that they're not just going to accept that as sort of just an automatic standard. So, for example, people say, oh, no, I couldn't employ in XYZ group because they just don't have the skills. They can't meet the inherent requirements, or the pool of suitably qualified persons didn't include the group I was looking at. They're not just going to accept that as, on face value. They're going to ask you, so what, did you do anything else? Was there nothing else that you could do? So you continue to, advertise in a specific space, and you continue to get the same group of people. Have you looked elsewhere? I mean, what have you done to kind of expand that group? So, but the things that will come into account in terms of your hiring, your promotions, etc., is inherent requirements of the job, the pool of suitably qualified people. So I do know that within the country, we go through phases where we, will be lacking in a particular a group of people, where we'll say, well, there's nobody going into that group in this particular gender and race. So there is a shortage of suitably qualified in that particular area, but it's not all the way around. The qualification, skills, experience, and to acquire within a reasonable time frame the ability to do the job. So what they're saying there is that, as an example, if you wanted to employ someone and you had the opportunity to employ someone who possibly didn't have exactly what you were looking for, but you had the ability to maybe give them more mentoring, guidance, and counseling, in terms of it would take 6 months maybe to get them to, where they needed to do. Can you give the person the opportunity, and would you be able to do it within a reasonable time frame? So they're still asking you to possibly invest a little bit more, if it's possible. If you need someone to hit the ground running and you don't have the ability to train and develop, that's fine. But where possible, if you have the ability to do so, then you should try and do so. Then the rates of turnover and natural attrition, which is what I spoke about before. So when you're looking at your plan, I would highly recommend, to make it more scientific, is to go, in the last 3 years, this has been our turnover and retention rate. I'm now going to apply that. I'm going to assume and forecast that it's going to be the same, or actually, I think it was too high in the last 3 years. I don't expect it to be that high, or I don't know, whatever, but start to apply ratios to your plan, so that you can say, I expect in the next 5 years that our headcount is going to grow from 100 to 110. That is based on what I've seen in, the past 3 years. So don't just do a thumbsuck, actually make it something more scientific. So much the same as you would do with your financials, I would do the same thing with your Employment Equity Act. And then the recruitment and promotional trends within the workplace. So that was, that comes out of the Code of Good Practice on the preparation, implementation, and monitoring of the EE plan. Now, that Code of Good Practice has been around for many, many years, which I'm not sure if people are aware of it, but there is a Code of Good Practice. If you would like a copy, I'm more than happy to send it to you. Alternatively, if you just go on Google and search for it, you'll be able to download it. One of the key things within the plan is a recommendation that you do have a communication strategy, which you put in place to determine how do you communicate employment equity within the business. Most people don't have that communication strategy, or at least not one that's written. But basically, it just says, how are you going to communicate with people? Is it on Teams? Do you have a folder? Is it a notice board? What are you going to be doing? Then in terms of, as I've spoken about, is the deviations. So in terms of the deviations, again, my understanding is every year they're going to compare what did you say you were going to achieve versus your workforce profile for that particular year. And you are going to have to justify at that point. I'm not entirely sure whether you will have the ability to tick a number of different options, but my understanding is that what they will do is they will have, these things over here. They may change it, and you now will have to write an explanation like we currently do to say, did you meet your employment equity objectives? My understanding is they're going to say, did you deviate? Tell us why. As I said, I don't know if they're going to say pick one box, or you must pick per category, or how it's going to work. But as I've said before, I would suggest that you keep that information, in terms of why did we deviate? We have a file in which we can prove why we deviated, and you are able to then pick one of these reasons in terms of the purpose or the reason for the deviation. If you're then audited, you are then able to say the reason why I said X, Y, and Z, remembering that I think what's going to happen is once you've done your submission, if you need a compliance certificate, you will then be able to go on and go, I don't have any awards against me at the CCMA. I don't have, I am compliant. I've done my, bits and pieces here. These are the reasons for the deviation. I assume that you will then be able to print out your compliance certificate. They will then, if they audit you and find out that you have not been honest or they don't agree with your reasons, then they can remove that certificate. But I think that what you'll be able to do is to download that certificate from the website, so from the portal, and you will be able to do that. I'm not sure if it's the portal will be open all year round. I suspect it will be the same as now, 1st of September to 15th of January. That will be the time that you will go on and apply for your certificate, which will then be valid for a year. It can then be taken away if they come and do an audit. Okay, so these are the reasons why you will deviate. I see I've got a question. I will email the Code of Good Practice. We'll email it afterwards, but I would look at that. Okay. And then what they've said here is that in terms of what are the consequences of you not meeting the targets. So if at the end of 5 years you have not met the target, you will need to provide justification. And again, these are the justifications that they are suggesting are what you would be able to use. And they specifically say here, the employer will incur no penalties or any form of disadvantage if in the compliance analysis of affirmative action in any workplace, there are justifiable, reasonable grounds for not complying with the targets. So much the same as they have now. Okay, when they do an audit, if they find that you are not making reasonable progress, you will then have to submit your reasons and your justifications. Remembering that this is going to be in 5 years from now, so it'll be 2030. How they end up managing that at 2030 in terms of audits, they possibly will see, did you achieve, did you not achieve? Maybe you will have to supply something at that time. I'm not entirely sure. What they will then do is decide, do they agree with you? If they don't agree with you, they can then refer you to the Labour Court, or they'll refer you to the Director General. And if you don't meet them, then I assume that there will be fines that you will then need to pay for non-compliance. Okay, but that is in 5 years' time. So as I've said before, my recommendation is that you need to prepare for 2030. So in 2030, when they say, why did you not meet the targets in year 1, year 2? So if you don't meet the targets in year 1, we then assume that you're going to have a deviation through the years. So you need to make sure that you're keeping that information in preparation for 2030. So if you are now needing to go to court, if you're under audit and they want to say what happened, you have to be in a position where you can justify whatever your reasons here. So it could be multiple reasons. And you're going to need to justify that. That's why going back to this over here, where we're doing the movements and shortfalls, where you're providing something similar to people who are recruiting. So we have XYZ positions available. What is our demographic that we're looking at? First priority, second priority, third priority. If you don't employ, or you come to me and it's not one of those, it's not first priority, second or third, you must come to me and explain why you can't, why do you need to deviate? And there's almost like a deviation form, if you want to call it that, but a justification from the manager or whoever it is stating why they didn't go with, but you have to give that information to the people that are recruiting. Otherwise, they'll always do what they've always done, which is, they won't have any knowledge. So that would be my suggestion in terms of going forward. Okay. I have explained this already. But the compliance certificate, as I've said, I don't believe that you will have to deregister specifically if you're less than 50. I'm not entirely sure, but I suspect that you will log online. So everybody will have a profile. You will then possibly, the same as it happens now, every year you get an activation letter, you will log on. So if you were less than 50 last year, for argument's sake, you will log on and now disclose to them that you're now more than 50. And I assume at that point, the portal for the reporting now opens. Or if, for argument's sake, you were more than 50 last year, but now you're less than 50, you will possibly go on and now disclose that you're less than 50, you may need to provide justification, but then the ability to report goes away. You will, however, have the ability to still download the certificate, remembering the certificate applies to every employer, especially if you want to work in government, and there's various, organizations that will probably require it. But specifically working with government, you need to have that certificate. And as I've suggested before, I assume you will also need to have it from a BEE perspective. So as soon as these certificates come through, I suspect that they're going to ask you for your compliance certificate as opposed to your acknowledgement of submission, but that remains to be seen. So if you don't have that compliance certificate, even if you're under 50, because BEE may apply to you, if you don't have that certificate, although you're not submitting from an equity perspective, they may still ask that from you because of harassment or, non-compliance with minimum wage. Okay, do the targets need to be met immediately in the first year? Okay, so it is a gradual, remembering that these targets here, I'm just going to go back a few slides, sorry. Okay, these targets here, I think it says it is the 5-year sectoral numerical target. So this percentage over here is what they want you to get to by 2030. Okay, so if you, for whatever reason, only become designated in 2027, they are wanting you still to achieve these targets by 2030. So you now don't start in 2027 and a 5-year plan forward. Everybody will work on the same thing. So they will give you 5 years to try and achieve these targets. And that's why I said, if you look at the new suggested plan, they ask you to give annual targets. So what is your plan to get there? So when you're doing your employment equity plan, as I said before, my suggestion is start at the end. So where do we think we're going to be in 2030? And then work your way back to say, well, how would we get there? But this is the end of 5 years. And then every year you would say, well, where do I think I'm going to be in year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4? And then in year 4, they will compare your workforce profile from year 4 to what your target was, which you cannot change in the 5 years. You can't change it. And then they will say to you, you said you were going to be here. This is where you actually are. What happened? Okay. And you will then need to look at that. Alrighty. Okay, so if currently non-designated employer, but staffing plan shows an expected recruitment by 2026 to above 50, would the plan be implemented in the same year? So yes, you would then, in year 26, which is next year, your plan in essence would then actually only be 4 years long, but it would run from 26 to 2030. So everyone, if you start in 2029, you will go 29 to 30. So that's what I suggested before. So if you have if you're expecting that during the next 5 years, you at some point are going to be designated, I would almost start looking at this now. Because even if you start in 2026, you now only have 4 years, which is not too bad. But if you think it's possibly going to happen in 2027, start looking at it now, because you're only going to have 3 years to achieve this. So one of the justifications possibly could be, we only started in 2028, but that you're still going to be held to the same standard. And even if you go to court and you do all of those things, that costs money and it's time and it's effort. So if you do expect that you're going to go over 50 at some point, have a look at the targets. Please remember, these are still proposed targets. These are not the signed-off targets, but I'm not entirely sure that they're going to change drastically. So have a look at this, and then we expect that the new targets are going to come out in April, and then you will use those to put your new plan in place. But if you suspect there's going to be changes, and remember, what you decide now in terms of you have to work to both EAP as well as the sector targets, although you're held to the sector targets. Okay. You will disregard your current plans once the new plan is in place. So regardless of if your current plan ends in 2028, that is now null and void as soon as your new plan is in place, and then your new plan becomes the one. So everyone will be the same 5 years, 2025 to 2030, and that's what you will look at. Alrighty. Okay, so the targets won't change. So one question is that the targets can or must change as the EAP changes? No, the sector targets are less than EAP. So remembering over here, they're asking you to look at, and I can't see what it says, but I think it's about 40%. So they're giving you a sector target and saying in your head counts, we're asking you to look at 40%. So we're only giving you 40%. EAP is out of 100%. What you do in here with the other 60% is your Indaba. But ultimately, they're saying at a minimum, we want you to have 25% top management to be designated groups and men. If you're more than 25% already in designated groups, then your next goal is EAP. So they're giving you bite-sized chunks now. But remember, this section over here is not 100%. So they're allowing you, so if you look over here on skilled technical, they're saying 88%, this is what we want you to achieve. It needs to be X for designated males and Y for designated females. What you do with the other 20% or 12% or whatever the percentage is, that is for you to do. So that can be foreign nationals, etc., etc. You can do what you like, but your ultimate goal is you need to work to the sector targets if you're not there already. If you are there, then goal number 2 is your EAP, which is why I said when you're looking at your sector targets, you can't say for argument's sake, well, 15% of designated, well, 15% of females in top management. Yes, I've got 15% females. If it happens to be all, for argument's sake, white females, you still have an obligation to go, well, white females. If we have all white females, the EAP for our particular province is not all white females. So we now need to look at it and go, that 15% is still not representative in terms of EAP. So when we're doing our recruitment, you need to now say, well, hang on a second in terms of EAP. So I've met my sector target, which is 15%, but EAP I'm still short on. So now when we look over here, so I know it says EAP over here, what you probably could do is say, have we met our plan, which is the sector target? How far away are we from EAP? So you look at both. And so you would all look at both, but the requirement in the next 5 years is to say, we want you to achieve the sector target, which is less than EAP. Okay. All right. So I think I have answered questions, having a look here. So I'm in a dashboard and I think I've actually come to the end. Yes, I have come to the end. So I don't know if anyone has any questions. I'm very happy to, if you want to post anything in the questions. But like I said before, if you have received that notice to attend the consultations with regard to your particular industry and the sector targets, I would highly recommend it. You know what happens in your industry. You're best placed to be able to give any comments, because ultimately they're going to hold you to this in 5 years' time. Okay. And try and make it a little bit more scientific, and make sure that you have all your T's crossed and your I's dotted. It's no longer just we'll put something in place and what happens. You will not be able to change it, and they are going to hold you to it. We will see in 5 years what does that look like. They are going to be holding you to it. And the audits that will take place within the 5 years are going to be around other areas of compliance. So they will be looking at, what does your committee look like? Have you trained your committee? What do your minutes look like? So have you actually consulted? So in the next couple of months, you need to make sure that you're talking to your committee, that the minutes are correct, that you have consulted, that they understand what's going on, that you have communicated. It's no longer something that just happens with a few people on the side. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the webinar. Okay, there is a question. If top management, for example, consists of one individual and there's no need for further, then we just go back to, I think if I just go back to the slide here. So the reason for you not meeting the target, so in any which way that you look at it, you'll still be over, you'll be underrepresented in most and over in one. Your justification there would be insufficient recruitment opportunities. Okay, so it's not to suggest that you now need to go and employ a whole lot of people, but in that particular position, you would then say, well, there were no opportunities. As soon as opportunities come available, then you need to look at it differently. Okay. I don't know if there's any other questions. I'm here for a few more minutes. If you have any questions, you're more than welcome to post them. Alternatively, if you do need assistance, please feel free to reach out. You can email us at hra@hrtorq.co.za, or you can email me directly, Nikki at HRTorq, so that's NICKY at HRTorq.co.za. This webinar will be on our YouTube channel in the next couple of days, so it won't be immediately, and then we will share the code of good practice with you after this meeting. But thank you very much for joining us. I do hope it was a good session, and good luck for your upcoming employment equity planning. Okay, thanks so much. I'll stay on for a few minutes if anybody's got any questions, but thanks everybody for joining. Hi. Okay, so I've got a question. Is it possible to get more detail in the disability element? Are you referring to what a disability is, or the percentage? So the current percentage in terms of the sector targets is 2%, but they do, so it is just 2% of the workforce. In terms of the disability, they have redefined it. I don't have it in front of me, but they have redefined it. So previously, I'm going to try and verbatim it, but it was a physical or mental impairment, so long-term or recurring physical or mental impairment, which substantially limited the entry into or advancement in employment. So that was the previous definition. The change in the legislation changed it to say it was both a physical and mental impairments, but they also then included, it was a lot broader. So it included other things which was not necessarily defined as mental or physical, but I'll have to send it to you, but it was a lot broader. So it included more things. So in terms of, spectrum disorders, which is not necessarily mental disorder, but it became a lot broader. So it allowed for things like ASD, possibly ADHD, but there's no specific list of disabilities. It is more around, in your particular workplace, is what the person has, does it limit their entry into or advancement in employment? If you can justify that and say, yes, it would, because I need to possibly accommodate in the workplace. So as an example, if you employ someone who has ASD as an example, so they can do the job 100%, but possibly because of their ASD, you might need to, allow them to be in an office on their own, for argument's sake. In that space, or possibly they can't necessarily advance in employment, whatever. So you may decide that they can't do that because of their ASD, but you provide accommodation. So in that sense, as long as you can justify, that might be considered a disability. In another workplace, maybe it's not even an issue. So it's not necessarily limited just to physical or mental. It now encompasses those things, but it's specifically related to, does it impact your ability to enter into? So if they disclose it up front, would you be reconsidering employing them because you kind of go, oh, it's going to be a problem? So if somebody comes to you with, I suffer from anxiety, this is something that happens, is your initial thing going, well, can I really have this person here? The job is stressful, etc., or whatever it is. If you're having to make accommodations or allow for, different things for that person, then it could be considered a disability specifically for employment equity. I hope that answers your question. but I will try and get the expanded version of the definition for you. Okay, any other questions? Okay, so if there's no other questions, I'm going to log off. But as I've said before, please feel free to reach out if you have any queries or you need any assistance. More than happy to help. And oh, you're typing your questions. Sorry. Okay, I'll stay on for you. So I'll stay on and wait for your question. Yeah, so that was one of the things that I raised in the beginning, which was oh, sorry, let me read it. Sorry, guys. So somebody is being audited currently based on the outgoing legislation, yet there's new amendments that just kicked in now. What is the logic? So just remember, so in terms of the audit, so being audited on the whether or not you've achieved your plan is one aspect. But in terms of the audits that they're looking at, remember that they're not, so there's a number of things that haven't changed. So when they do the audits, a number of things that they look at is when you did your original plan, did you consult, were your targets, so one of the big things that they're looking at now is do they accept the targets that you put in place. Now, whether that makes sense or not, so, you know, if they don't agree with your targets, a lot of them are saying then you need to do a brand new plan, which doesn't make any sense. However, remember that there is a question that I posed in the beginning, is that we have some clients that their plans are going to end, for argument's sake, say in February. So the question is do we put in a new plan from March to September? So in the space that they are saying to you, we don't agree with your old plan, I'm not entirely sure if you still need to have the old plan that now becomes a updated plan until, I don't know, 1st of September, or if they're auditing you on other aspects not relating to the EAP. So they're still going to be checking compliance on other aspects. If they're saying that your targets were incorrect, I'm not entirely sure what the logic is in that. But it could be because they're still going to be holding you to that plan until such time as the new plan comes into effect. But we're still asking questions regarding that kind of thing. So, yeah. Sorry, that's not a very helpful answer. Sorry, but that's all I have for you. Okay. Any other questions? Alrighty. Okay, so if there are no other questions, I'm going to log off now. Please feel free to email us or reach out to us if you have any other questions. Thank you for joining me today. Much appreciated, and I do hope you found this session useful. Thanks, everybody.